The persistent drip of water from a leaky gutter, provided unwelcome background music as Ethan Reeves sanded down a century-old banister in Mrs. Henderson's Victorian home. His calloused hands moved with practiced precision, revealing the rich cherry wood hidden beneath decades of paint and neglect. At 42, Ethan had spent over 20 years restoring historic homes throughout Pinewood Valley, earning a reputation as the man who could breathe life back into forgotten places. "That's looking beautiful," Mrs. Henderson said, appearing at his side with a glass of lemonade. "My grandfather installed that banister himself in 1927. Ethan nodded appreciatively, taking the glass. He knew what he was doing. "The craftsmanship here is exceptional. Just needed someone to remember it." His phone buzzed in his pocket, the third call in the last hour. Ethan frowned, wiping his hands on a rag before checking the screen. The same unknown number. "I should take this," he told Mrs. Henderson. "Probably another job." Stepping onto the covered porch, Ethan answered. "Reeves Restoration. Mr. Reeves?" "I'm Olivia Patterson." The woman's voice carried a note of quiet desperation. "I inherited the Willow Creek Inn from my grandmother 6 months ago, and well, it's falling apart faster than I can manage. Someone in town said you're the person to call." Ethan leaned against the porch railing, recalling the once charming bed and breakfast on the edge of town. He'd driven past it recently, noticing the peeling paint and sagging porch. The place had been closed for at least 2 years. "I've seen the property. What kind of timeline are you working with?" A pause. "I'd like to have it operational by fall, but I realize that might be unrealistic. The insurance inspector said the roof needs immediate attention and there's water damage in the west wing." Ethan closed his eyes, mentally reviewing his schedule. He was booked solid for the next 3 months with various projects around town. Taking on a restoration as extensive as Willow Creek would require rearranging everything. "I'm pretty backed up right now," he said honestly. "Have you contacted Belridge Construction? They handle commercial renovations?" "I did." Another pause, longer this time. Their quote was, "Beyond my means. I'm working with limited funds from my grandmother's estate, but I understand if you can't help." Something in her voice, resignation mixed with determination, struck a chord. Ethan had restored enough homes to know that sometimes the most important repairs weren't to the structures themselves, but to the lives of the people who inhabited them. "I could at least come take a look," he found himself saying. "Tomorrow morning, maybe? Give you an honest assessment." "That would be wonderful," Olivia replied, relief evident in her voice. "Any time works for me. I'm living on site." After arranging the details, Ethan returned to his work, wondering why he'd agreed to even consider the job. The Henderson project would wrap up next week, followed by the Miller farmhouse restoration and the town library's historical room. Adding Willow Creek to his schedule made no logical sense. The following morning arrived with mist clinging to the valley floor as Ethan drove his weathered blue pickup toward Willow Creek Inn. The property sat nestled among ancient oak trees at the end of a winding gravel drive, the 3-story structure a faded testament to more prosperous times. As he pulled up, Ethan noticed a woman on her knees in what had once been a garden, stubbornly digging around overgrown rose bushes. She stood as he approached, brushing soil from her jeans. "Mr. Reeves?" she asked, offering a gardening gloved hand before thinking better of it and removing the glove. "I'm Olivia." She wasn't what he'd expected. Mid-30s, perhaps, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent hazel eyes that held equal measures of worry and resolve. No wedding ring, but a faint tan line suggested a recent removal. "Just Ethan is fine," he replied, shaking her hand. "You been working on the garden?" Olivia glanced back at her modest progress. "Trying to. My grandmother was the one with the green thumb. I'm just hoping to save what I can before everything's completely overrun." "Sometimes you got to clear things out before new growth can happen," Ethan said, then felt foolish at the obvious metaphor. "Should we take a look inside?" As they walked toward the house, Ethan noticed Olivia's slight limp, an injury or perhaps a permanent condition. She caught his glance and smiled ruefully. "Car accident 2 years ago. Still acts up when I overdo it, which seems to be daily around here." The front porch creaked ominously under their weight, and Ethan immediately identified several structural issues that would need addressing. Inside, the inn was a curious mixture of faded elegance and disrepair. High ceilings with ornate molding, hardwood floors that had once gleamed, a grand staircase with intricate woodwork that reminded him of Mrs. Henderson's banister, and everywhere, small touches that spoke of the life that had once filled the space. Vintage photographs, handcrafted quilts draped over furniture, shelves of leather-bound books. "My grandmother ran this place for 42 years, Olivia said softly, watching Ethan as he examined a cracked ceiling beam. "After she died, I was in the middle of a divorce and couldn't manage it immediately. I should have come sooner." Ethan nodded, understanding the regret in her voice. He'd heard similar sentiments from many clients over the years, the wish that they'd acted earlier to preserve what mattered. "Let me show you the worst areas," Olivia continued, leading him through the main floor toward the west wing. "I've been staying in one of the east rooms. Those are still relatively dry." As they toured the property, Ethan's initial concerns multiplied. The roof would need complete replacement. Several load-bearing walls showed signs of water damage. The electrical system was dangerously outdated. It would be a massive undertaking, easily 6 months of work with a full crew. "I know it's overwhelming," Olivia said as they completed the tour in what had once been the inn's cozy dining room. "I've been trying to tackle small projects myself, but—" "You've been doing repair work?" Ethan asked, surprised. Olivia gestured toward a section of replaced floorboards. "YouTube tutorials. Not professional quality, but better than falling through to the cellar." Ethan examined her work, imperfect but determined. "Just like the garden outside. Why is this place so important to you?" he asked suddenly. It would be easier to sell the property. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She walked to a window, looking out at the overgrown grounds. "This inn is the only place I've ever felt truly at home," she answered finally. "When my parents divorced, I spent summers here with my grandmother. Later, when my own marriage was failing, this is where I came to heal." She turned to face him. "I'm not naive about how much work it needs, but I believe it's worth saving." Ethan recognized the sentiment. It was what had drawn him to restoration work in the first place, the belief that broken things didn't have to remain broken. "I'll help you," he heard himself saying, against all practical judgment. "But we'll need to prioritize. Roof first, then structural repairs. The cosmetic work can wait." The smile that bloomed across Olivia's face transformed her features, revealing a glimpse of the woman beneath the worry. "Thank you," she said simply. "When can you start?" "Monday," Ethan replied, already mentally rescheduling his other projects. "And Ms. Patterson? This won't be easy." "It's just Olivia," she corrected, echoing his earlier words. "And I don't expect it to be easy." She offered her hand again, this time with confidence. "I expect it to be worth it." As Ethan drove away from Willow Creek Inn, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just accepted far more than a renovation project. Something about the determined woman and her grandmother's fading inn had awakened a response in him that had nothing to do with carpentry or restoration. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of anticipation that extended beyond the satisfaction of his craft, and that perhaps was the most unexpected development of all. Foundations. The morning sun filtered through the ancient oak trees as Ethan's truck rumbled up the gravel driveway of Willow Creek Inn. It was Monday, exactly as promised, and he arrived with his truck bed loaded with tools, lumber, and the first batch of supplies. He'd spent the weekend rearranging his schedule, calling clients to explain delays, and ordering materials for the mammoth task ahead. When he pulled up, he spotted Olivia on the porch, hair tied back. Dressed in work clothes and holding 2 steaming mugs, she descended the steps carefully, mindful of her limp, and approached his vehicle. "I figured you'd be an early riser," she said, offering him a mug. "Black coffee, right?" Ethan accepted it gratefully. "How'd you guess?" "You strike me as a no-nonsense kind of man," she replied with a small smile. "I brought donuts, too. Fuel for the day ahead." Something about her quiet thoughtfulness caught him off guard. His clients were typically cordial, but maintained a professional distance. Olivia seemed determined to blur that line from the start. "I appreciate it, but you don't need to feed me," he said, taking a sip. The coffee was strong and exactly what he needed. "Considerate, enlightened self-interest," she responded. "The better I treat you, the less likely you are to flee when you discover even more problems with this place." Ethan chuckled despite himself. "Fair enough. Speaking of problems, I'd like to start with a closer inspection of the roof and attic spaces. The weather report says rain by Thursday, and we need to address the worst leaks immediately." Together, they ventured into the attic, a cavernous space beneath the inn's steep roof. Ethan moved methodically, testing beams, examining water stains, and occasionally poking his head through access panels to view the underside of the roof itself. "It's worse than I initially thought," he admitted, running his hand along a rotting beam. "This section has been taking on water for years. We'll need to replace several major support structures before we can even address the roof properly." To his surprise, Olivia didn't look defeated. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "What can I do to help?" "You want to help with the actual construction?" "I can follow instructions," she said firmly. "And I can't afford to pay you for every hour this will take. We need to work out some arrangement where I can contribute." Ethan considered her offer. Most homeowners prefer to stay far away from the messy, physical work of restoration. "Have you ever done any carpentry before? Beyond those YouTube floor repairs?" "My grandfather was a hobbyist woodworker. I used to help him in his shop when I visited during summers. I know my way around basic tools, though nothing on your professional level." For the next hour, Ethan tested her claims, showing her how to identify different types of damage and teaching her to handle various tools. She was a quick study, asking intelligent questions and demonstrating surprising strength despite her slender frame. "You'll do," he finally declared. "We'll start with demolition in the west wing. I need to expose the full extent of the water damage before we can begin repairs." They spent the remainder of the day carefully removing damaged drywall, Ethan teaching Olivia to look for signs of mold and structural weaknesses. By late afternoon, they had filled several debris bags and exposed the skeleton of the West Wing's outer wall. "This is actually satisfying," Olivia admitted, wiping sweat from her brow as they paused for water. "Destructive but satisfying," Ethan nodded. "Demolition usually is. It's concrete progress, visible results. The restoration phase is slower, more meticulous. Like life," she mused. "Tearing down happens quickly. Rebuilding takes time." Her comment hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken personal context. Ethan found himself wondering about her divorce, about what had led her back to this place seeking restoration of her own. As if reading his thoughts, Olivia changed the subject. "I was thinking of ordering pizza for dinner. Would you like to stay? We could discuss the project timeline." The invitation caught Ethan off guard. He typically maintained professional boundaries with clients, heading home after a day's work to his quiet house on the edge of town. But something about Olivia's straightforward manner and the enormity of the project ahead made him reconsider his usual routine. "Pizza sounds good," he heard himself say, "as long as you let me pay." Later, seated at the kitchen table, the one area of the inn that remained fully functional, they spread out Ethan's preliminary plans while sharing a pepperoni pizza. "If we're lucky with weather and suppliers, we might get the critical structural work and new roofing done within 6 weeks, Ethan explained, pointing to his timeline. "After that, we can address the interior damage room by room." Olivia studied the plans, her expression thoughtful. "My grandmother used to say this place had a soul of its own, that it responded to care and neglect in equal measure." She looked up at him. "Do you ever feel that way about the buildings you restore?" The question might have sounded fanciful coming from someone else, but from Olivia it seemed genuine. "I've worked on enough historic properties to understand what she meant," Ethan admitted. "Some places seem to cooperate with the restoration. Others fight you every step of the way." "And which kind is Willow Creek?" she asked, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. Ethan considered the day's work, the way the old building had revealed its wounds and strengths to them. "I think it's waiting to see our intentions," he said finally. "Whether we respect what it was, or just want to force it into something new." Olivia's expression softened. "My grandmother would have liked you," she said quietly. The simple statement carried unexpected weight. Ethan found himself wanting to know more about the woman who had created this place, and the granddaughter who was determined to save it. "Tell me about her," he requested. Olivia's face lit up as she began sharing stories, how her grandmother had purchased the property in the 1970s when it was little more than a ramshackle farmhouse, gradually transforming it into the inn that became renowned throughout the region. How she had raised Olivia's father alone after her grandfather died young. How she had welcomed Olivia with open arms during every difficult period of her life. "She built this place as a refuge," Olivia explained. "Not just for travelers, but for anyone who needed sanctuary. That's what I want to restore, not just the building, but its purpose." As she spoke, Ethan noticed how the kitchen, with its vintage appliances and worn but well-cared-for furniture, reflected that philosophy. It wasn't sleek or modern, but it was inviting, authentic in a way that newer spaces rarely achieved. "What about you?" Olivia asked suddenly. "How did you get into restoration work?" Ethan rarely discussed his personal history with clients, but the question seemed natural in the context of their conversation. "My father was a contractor, new construction mostly. I worked for him through high school and college learning the trade." He paused, considering how much to share. "We had different philosophies. He was all about efficiency and modern techniques. I found myself drawn to older buildings, to preserving craftsmanship that was disappearing." He didn't mention the arguments that had eventually led to their estrangement, or how his father had dismissed historic restoration as sentimental nonsense compared to the profitability of new developments. "When did you start your own business?" Olivia prompted, seeming genuinely interested. 15 years ago. Started with small projects, window repairs, porch restorations. Word spread, and eventually I had enough work to focus exclusively on historic properties." "And you never wanted to do anything else?" The question gave him pause. "There was a time I considered architecture, even got accepted to a graduate program. But it would have meant leaving Pinewood Valley and I—" He trailed off, surprised by his own willingness to reveal personal details. "You couldn't leave," Olivia finished for him. "I understand that feeling." Their eyes met across the table, and Ethan felt an unexpected connection, a recognition of shared values that transcended their professional relationship. Both were bound to places and principles in ways that defied simple explanation. The moment was interrupted by Ethan's phone buzzing, with a text from his supplier confirming the delivery of roofing materials for the following day. "I should head out," he said, suddenly conscious of how comfortable he'd become in her kitchen, in her presence. "Early start tomorrow if we want to make progress before the rain comes." Olivia nodded, walking him to the door. "Thank you, Ethan. Not just for taking on this impossible project, but for seeing what this place could be again." In the fading twilight, with the old inn silhouetted against the darkening sky, Ethan realized he was beginning to see much more than just the building's potential. The woman standing beside him with her quiet strength and clear vision was becoming as intriguing as the restoration project itself. As he drove home through the familiar streets of Pinewood Valley, Ethan found himself contemplating foundations, not just the physical ones that supported Willow Creek Inn, but the emotional ones that shaped lives and choices. He had the unsettling feeling that in accepting this project, he might be dismantling some of his own carefully constructed boundaries. The thought should have alarmed him. Instead, he found himself looking forward to whatever the next day might reveal. Hidden walls. 3 weeks into the restoration of Willow Creek Inn, Ethan and Olivia had settled into a rhythm of work that felt surprisingly natural. Each morning began with coffee on the porch, reviewing the day's goals before diving into the labor that left them both exhausted by evening. They had managed to replace the most critical roof sections just before a week of heavy rain tested their work, revealing only minor leaks that were quickly addressed. Today, they were tackling the main hallway of the second floor, where Ethan had discovered irregular spacing between 2 guest rooms that suggested a hidden space, possibly a closet or small storage area that had been sealed off during previous renovations. "Ready?" Ethan asked, positioning his pry bar against the suspicious section of wall. Olivia stood nearby with a dust mask and flashlight. "Ready," she confirmed. though I'm still not convinced my grandmother would have walled up perfectly good storage space. She was obsessive about organization. Ethan carefully began removing the drywall, revealing older lath and plaster behind it. This was definitely a later addition, he noted. Someone covered up whatever was here, probably in the 80s based on the materials. As the opening widened, Olivia directed her flashlight into the darkness, revealing a small room approximately 6 feet square. Unlike the dusty emptiness they expected, the space contained several stacked boxes and what appeared to be an old trunk. "It's like finding buried treasure," Olivia whispered, stepping carefully through the opening Ethan had created. The room had no windows, but once they'd rigged up a temporary light, they discovered that the space had once been a small sewing or reading room, with built-in shelving and a window that had been covered over from both sides. Why would anyone seal this up? Ethan wondered aloud, examining the craftsmanship of the built-in cabinets. The woodwork in here is exceptional. Olivia was already opening one of the boxes, her expression a mixture of curiosity and reverence. "These are my grandmother's journals," she said softly, lifting out a leather-bound book. "And photographs I've never seen before." For the next hour, their restoration work was forgotten as they carefully examined the contents of the hidden room. The trunk contained vintage clothing, while the boxes held decades of personal writings, photographs, and mementos that documented not only the history of the inn, but the life of Olivia's grandmother, Eleanor Patterson. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, Olivia opened one of the journals, dated 1975. "Listen to this. The bank manager laughed when I applied for a loan today. Said a widow had no business taking on a property this size. I withdrew my life savings and walked out. There are other banks, and I am not without resources." She looked up at Ethan. I had no idea she faced such opposition when she started this place. Ethan, who had been examining some of the photographs, handed her one that showed a much younger Eleanor standing proudly in front of the then dilapidated property. "She had the same determination I see in you," he observed. Olivia accepted the photograph, her fingers tracing her grandmother's face. "I always saw her as invincible. I never considered the struggles she must have faced." They continued exploring the hidden collection, discovering correspondence that revealed Eleanor had been forced to reinvent her life after her husband's death left her with substantial debts and a young son to raise. The inn had been both her livelihood and her statement of independence. "There's so much here about the renovation she did," Olivia said, leafing through another journal. "Detailed notes about materials, techniques, even the craftsmen she hired." She paused, reading more closely. "Ethan, look at this. She writes about working with a carpenter named Thomas Reeves in 1977. Any relation to you?" Ethan took the journal, recognition dawning as he read the entry. "That was my grandfather," he said quietly. "He specialized in historic woodwork. I never knew he worked on this property. The discovery created an unexpected connection between them, their families' histories, intertwined through the very building they were now restoring together." As afternoon faded into evening, they carefully moved the boxes and trunk to Olivia's room for further examination. Ethan restored power to the hidden space and began assessing how to properly incorporate it back into the inn's layout. "We could make this a special reading nook for guests," Olivia suggested, her earlier exhaustion replaced by excitement. "With the window restored and some of my grandmother's books on display." Ethan nodded, already visualizing the possibilities. "The craftsmanship in here deserves to be showcased," he agreed, "and it connects the inn's past with its future." Later, as they shared takeout from the local diner in what had become their usual spot in the kitchen, Olivia continued reading excerpts from Eleanor's journals. The parallels between her grandmother's journey and her own situation were striking. Both women rebuilding their lives after major upheavals, both facing financial and personal challenges in the process. "She writes about feeling overwhelmed," Olivia said softly, "about wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake taking on this place. But then there are these moments of absolute certainty where she knew she was exactly where she needed to be." She looked up at Ethan. "I've been having those same moments lately." Before Ethan could respond, his phone rang. The name on the screen, Rebecca Miller, made him hesitate before answering. "I should take this," he said, stepping outside onto the porch. The conversation was brief but unsettling. Rebecca, his ex-fiancée, had returned to Pinewood Valley after a 5-year absence and wanted to meet for coffee. "To catch up," she'd said, though Ethan suspected there was more to her sudden reappearance. When he returned to the kitchen, Olivia was putting away their dinner containers, her expression carefully neutral. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Fine," Ethan replied automatically, then reconsidered. After weeks of working side by side, sharing meals and stories, he owed her more honesty than that. Actually, that was Rebecca Miller. "We were engaged 5 years ago. She left town rather suddenly, took a job in Chicago. Apparently she's back." Olivia absorbed this information with a thoughtful nod. "And she wants to see you?" "Coffee tomorrow," Ethan confirmed, surprised by his own discomfort with the idea. "Probably nothing important." "You don't need to explain," Olivia said, though something in her tone had shifted, a new reserve entering her voice. "We all have pasts that occasionally resurface." The atmosphere between them had changed, the easy companionship of the day retreating behind newly erected boundaries. Ethan found himself wanting to explain more about how Rebecca had abandoned their wedding plans just 2 months before the ceremony, about how her departure had reinforced his belief that professional detachment was safer than emotional investment. Instead, he focused on practical matters. "I'll be a bit late tomorrow," he said. "Meeting the supplier about the special order millwork for the main staircase first, then coffee." Olivia nodded. "Take whatever time you need. I'll keep working on stripping the woodwork in the hidden room." As Ethan drove home that night, he found himself thinking about the hidden room and what it represented, a sealed-off piece of history that contained unexpected connections and revelations. It struck him that people operated similarly, compartmentalizing aspects of themselves that were too painful or complicated to integrate into their daily lives. He had sealed off parts of himself after Rebecca left, his willingness to trust, his openness to possibilities beyond work. Working with Olivia had begun to change that, creating cracks in walls he hadn't even realized he'd built. Tomorrow's coffee with Rebecca suddenly felt like a test. Of what? He wasn't entirely sure. But as he thought about Eleanor Patterson's journals and the parallels between generations, Ethan wondered if perhaps the past was resurfacing now for a reason, forcing both him and Olivia to confront what they had hidden away before they could truly move forward. The next morning, when Ethan arrived at the cafe where he was meeting Rebecca, he was surprised to find himself more curious than anxious. 5 years had dulled the sharp edges of betrayal, leaving mostly questions about what might have been, and whether it would have actually made him happy. Rebecca looked much as she had when she left. Polished, confident, beautiful in the conventional way that had once seemed so important to him. But as she explained her reason for returning to Pinewood Valley, a corporate position that would allow her to open a branch office in their hometown, Ethan realized something fundamental had changed. He was no longer drawn to the ambition and restlessness that defined her. Instead, he found himself thinking about Olivia's quiet determination, her respect for history and tradition, her ability to find meaning in the painstaking work of restoration rather than the flash of new construction. When Rebecca hinted at rekindling their relationship, Ethan was surprised by how easily he declined. "We're different people now," he told her gently. "I think we both know that's for the best." He left the cafe feeling lighter than he had in years, as if he had finally removed the last of the barriers that had been limiting his view of what might be possible. His steps quickened as he headed back toward Willow Creek Inn, eager to continue the work of restoration, not just of the building, but of the connections it fostered and the futures it might contain. Weathering storms. The weather forecast had been tracking the approaching storm system for days, but nothing could have prepared Ethan and Olivia for the ferocity of the winds that began to batter Willow Creek Inn shortly after midnight. Ethan had been working late, installing new window frames in the front parlor, when the first ominous gusts rattled the glass panes. "That doesn't sound good," Olivia said, entering the room with 2 mugs of tea. She'd taken to joining him during his evening work sessions, sometimes helping, sometimes simply keeping him company while reviewing her grandmother's journals. Ethan moved to the window, peering out at the darkened landscape. The ancient oaks that surrounded the property were swaying dramatically, their branches scraping against the roof like skeletal fingers. Weather Service just upgraded it to a severe storm warning, he said, checking his phone. Potential for flash flooding and wind damage. They exchanged a concerned look, both thinking of the partially restored roof and the exposed areas where renovation was still in progress. Over the past 6 weeks, they had made significant progress. The structure was largely sound again, but several areas remained vulnerable. We should secure what we can, Ethan decided. I've got tarps and reinforcement materials in my truck. For the next hour, they worked frantically to protect the inn against the impending storm. Ethan climbed onto the roof to secure additional tarps over sections where new shingles hadn't yet been installed, while Olivia moved valuable items away from windows and areas prone to leaking. The time the rain began, a violent deluge that seemed to attack the building from all angles. They had done everything possible to minimize potential damage. Now all they could do was wait and watch. You should head home while the roads are still passable, Olivia suggested as they stood in the front hallway. Listening to the intensifying storm, Ethan shook his head. I'm staying. The creek at the bottom of the property could flood, cutting off access. Besides, we might need to address issues as they develop. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, harsh flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the foundation itself. The storm's right overhead, Ethan observed grimly. As if in response, the lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the inn into darkness. Power's out, Olivia sighed. I have emergency lanterns in the kitchen. By lantern light, they established a command center in the kitchen, the most structurally sound room in the house, spreading towels beneath, known weak spots and positioning buckets under new, leaks that developed as the storm intensified. Around 2 a.m., a particularly violent gust of wind was followed by a tremendous crash from the east side of the building. They rushed to investigate, finding that a massive oak branch had smashed through a second-floor window, allowing rain to pour into one of the newly restored guest rooms. Hold the lantern, Ethan instructed, quickly assessing the damage. We need to get that branch out and cover the opening before the water ruins the flooring we just finished. Together, they managed to carefully extract the branch and secure a tarp over the broken window. Olivia worked alongside Ethan with surprising efficiency, anticipating his needs and remaining calm despite the chaos of the storm. As they mopped up the water that had already entered, Ethan found himself impressed by her resilience. Many property owners would be devastated by this setback, but Olivia seemed to take it in stride. We're lucky it didn't hit the main roof, she commented, wringing water from a towel. This we can fix relatively easily. Your optimism is remarkable, Ethan observed, helping her move a waterlogged area rug. Olivia shrugged, her face ghostly in the lantern light. My grandmother always said you can judge people's character by how they handle 3 things: lost luggage, unexpected guests, and storm damage. The comment startled a laugh from Ethan despite the tense situation. Sounds like a wise woman, she was. Olivia's expression softened with memory. She weathered plenty of literal and figurative storms in her life. I'm just trying to live up to her example. Throughout the night, they moved from room to room, addressing new leaks as they developed and monitoring the structure for signs of stress. During brief lulls in the storm, they returned to the kitchen for coffee and brief respites from their vigilance. During one such break, as dawn approached and the worst of the storm began to subside, Ethan found himself studying Olivia across the kitchen table. Her hair had come loose from its customary ponytail, and smudges of dirt marked her cheek where she'd absently brushed it with dusty fingers. She looked exhausted, but somehow more vital than ever, a woman fully engaged with the challenges before her. What? She asked, noticing his gaze. I was just thinking that most people would have given up by now, he said honestly. First, the extent of the restoration needed, then the discovery of your grandmother's hidden room stirring up the past, and now this storm damage. You've had every excuse to walk away. Olivia considered his words, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. I suppose I have, she agreed, but that's not who I am. And I think you knew that from the beginning. The observation carried a weight beyond the immediate context of their conversation. Since his coffee with Rebecca 2 weeks earlier, something had shifted between them, a new awareness that neither had fully acknowledged. I recognized something in you, Ethan admitted. The same thing that draws me to these old buildings, the value of restoration over replacement. The understanding that sometimes the most meaningful path is also the most difficult. Olivia's expression softened. Is that why you turned down the Marshall project? Greta at the diner mentioned they offered you a substantial contract for their new development. Ethan was surprised she knew about that. The Marshall Group had approached him about overseeing the historical aspects of a large new housing development, a job that would have been far more lucrative than his work at Willow Creek. Partly, he acknowledged. Their idea of historical preservation was salvaging a few decorative elements while demolishing the original structures. I couldn't be part of that. And the other part? Olivia pressed gently. Ethan met her gaze across the table. I made a commitment to you, to this project. I don't walk away from my commitments. The words hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. For weeks they had been building something alongside the restoration work, a connection neither had anticipated, but both had come to value deeply. Before Olivia could respond, a new sound intruded, the harsh beep of Ethan's phone receiving a text message as cell service returned. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. What is it? Olivia asked. Rebecca, he said, an edge entering his voice. She's been trying to reach me all night, apparently. The Marshall Group has offered me a partnership position if I'll reconsider their project. That's quite an opportunity, Olivia said carefully, her earlier warmth retreating behind a neutral expression. It would mean abandoning Willow Creek, Ethan said bluntly, at least temporarily. They want me to start immediately. The atmosphere in the kitchen chilled perceptibly. You should consider it, Olivia said, rising from the table. Partnership positions don't come along every day. Olivia, Ethan began, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. We should check the West Wing again, she said briskly. The storm's subsiding, but that section is still vulnerable. For the remainder of the morning, they worked side by side, assessing the storm damage, but the easy camaraderie of the night had vanished. In its place was a careful professionalism that felt more isolating than if they'd been working alone. By noon, when the storm had fully passed and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds, Ethan had compiled a complete list of new repairs needed. The damage was substantial but not catastrophic, a testament to their preventative efforts and the structural work already completed. I'll order the replacement materials today, Ethan said as they stood on the front porch, surveying the debris-strewn grounds. We can probably get back on schedule within 2 weeks. Olivia nodded, her gaze fixed on the distance. If that works with your other commitments, the pointed reference to the Marshall offer hung between them. Ethan felt a surge of frustration at her assumption that he would abandon their project. I haven't accepted their offer, he said tersely. But you're considering it, she replied, finally meeting his eyes. It wasn't a question. I would be foolish not to consider it, Ethan countered. Just as you would be foolish not to consider selling this property to developers who could restore it without the financial constraints you're under. The suggestion struck a nerve, just as he'd known it would. Olivia's expression hardened. This isn't about money for me. Nor for me, Ethan retorted. But we both have to be practical about our choices. The conversation was veering into dangerous territory, addressing not just their professional relationship, but the personal connection that had been developing alongside it. Neither seemed prepared to navigate those waters in the exhausted aftermath of the storm. I should get some rest, Olivia said finally, and you probably need to respond to your offer. The hesitation before the final word carried volumes of unspoken meaning. Ethan recognized that she wasn't just referring to the Marshall Group partnership, but to whatever Rebecca might be proposing personally as well. We'll talk tomorrow, he said. Not quite a promise, but not quite a dismissal either. As he drove away from opening doors, The grand reopening of Willow Creek Inn was scheduled for the first weekend of October, when the surrounding hills would be ablaze with autumn colors, and the crisp air would enhance the appeal of the inn's newly restored fireplaces. The date had seemed impossibly ambitious when Ethan and Olivia first marked it on their planning calendar 5 months earlier. Now, with just 1 week remaining, it seemed like both a miracle and an inevitability that they would meet their target. Ethan stood in what had once been the hidden room, now transformed into a reading nook that showcased both Eleanor Patterson's book collection and the exquisite original woodwork that his grandfather had crafted decades earlier. Sunlight streamed through the restored window, highlighting the warm tones of the cherry bookshelves and the carefully refurbished antique reading chair. "It's perfect," Olivia said from the doorway, carrying a tray with coffee and the cinnamon rolls that had become their Saturday morning tradition. "Exactly as I imagined it." She placed the tray on the small table they had commissioned from a local woodworker, a piece designed to complement the historical elements while serving modern needs, with its built-in charging station for guests' devices. "Your grandmother would approve," Ethan replied, accepting a mug. "It honors the original vision while adapting to contemporary expectations." That balance between preservation and adaptation had guided their entire approach to the restoration. After the storm 3 months earlier, they had faced difficult decisions about how to proceed, particularly given the substantial new damage and the financial constraints that had become increasingly pressing. The morning after the storm, Ethan had arrived at Willow Creek earlier than usual, having spent a sleepless night contemplating the Marshall Group's offer and what it represented. He found Olivia on the porch, similarly exhausted, but with a determined set to her shoulders that he had come to recognize as her problem-solving posture. "I've been thinking," they both said simultaneously, then paused, sharing a small smile that eased some of the previous day's tension. "You first," Olivia offered. Ethan took a deep breath. "I'm declining the Marshall offer," he said simply. "It's not the right fit for me or my values." Relief flickered across Olivia's face before she composed herself. "Are you sure?" It was a significant opportunity. "I'm sure," Ethan confirmed. "But we still have the issue of the storm damage and the remaining restoration costs. Which brings me to a proposal." He outlined a plan that had formed during his sleepless night, a community restoration initiative that would invite local craftspeople, history enthusiasts, and former guests of the inn to contribute to specific aspects of the rebuilding process. Volunteers could help with basic tasks, while skilled artisans might donate or discount their services in exchange for recognition and the satisfaction of preserving a beloved local landmark. "It's not charity," Ethan emphasized, knowing Olivia's pride might resist such framing. "It's community investment. Your grandmother created something that mattered to a lot of people. They might welcome the chance to help preserve it." To his surprise, Olivia didn't immediately reject the idea. "I've been thinking along similar lines," she admitted. "Not just about funding the repairs, but about the inn's purpose moving forward." She shared her vision of Willow Creek as more than just accommodations for travelers, a center for heritage crafts, historical education, and community gatherings. The storm damage had forced her to reconsider her original, more conventional business model in favor of something that better honored Eleanor's legacy while creating new sources of revenue. "If we're going to invite community involvement in the restoration," she reasoned, "we should extend that spirit to the inn's future operation as well." That conversation had marked a turning point, not just for the project, but for their relationship. The careful distance that had developed in the wake of Rebecca's reappearance and the Marshall offer gradually dissolved as they worked together to implement their new vision. The response from the community exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Former guests sent donations along with stories about their stays at Willow Creek during Eleanor's tenure. Local artisans offered specialized services, from custom millwork to period-appropriate light fixtures. Even the town council approved a heritage preservation grant that helped fund the most critical structural repairs. Most surprisingly, several of Ethan's regular clients volunteered their own skills, creating a rotation of experienced hands that accelerated the restoration timeline dramatically. The project that had once seemed overwhelming became manageable through this unexpected collaboration. Now, as they sat in the reading nook enjoying their coffee and the quiet satisfaction of near completion, Ethan marveled at how differently events had unfolded from his initial expectations when he'd first agreed to evaluate the property. "When you called me that day," he said, "I had no idea we'd end up here." Olivia smiled, understanding the multiple layers of his statement. "Neither did I," she admitted. "I was just desperate to save my grandmother's inn. I never imagined we'd transform it, or that it would transform us." The transformation had indeed been mutual. Through the journals discovered in the hidden room, Olivia had connected with her grandmother's strength and vision in ways that helped heal her own past wounds. The community's response to their restoration initiative had given her a sense of belonging she'd been seeking since her divorce. For Ethan, the changes were equally profound. The rigid boundaries he'd maintained between his professional and personal life had gradually dissolved as he found himself drawn not just to the historical significance of Willow Creek, but to the woman whose determination matched his own. Rebecca had eventually accepted his decision to decline the Marshall partnership, though not without a parting observation that had stayed with him. "You've changed, Ethan. You're building something that matters to you personally, not just professionally. I never thought I'd see that again."